Welcome to Whiskey Lore. I'm Drew Hanish. Well, I hope you're enjoying the Whiskey Rebellion. We've got one more episode coming up in that series. But before we get to that episode, I had a conversation recently with Will Pitchforth, who is the head of commercial at Bladnoch Distillery. Now, Bladnoch is a Lowland whiskey that, of course, it's based in Scotland, but it's actually owned by an Australian. David Pryor bought the distillery in 2015, and so we're going to be talking to Will from his offices in Australia, and we're going to do this through a Zoom call. We're going to talk a little bit about Lowland Whiskey and its resurgence. We're going to talk about mothballing of distilleries, which is something that has happened at Bladnoch over and over again, and something that they're experiencing right now. And if you don't understand what mothballing of distillery is, we're going to go into some of the issues that surround doing that. Sometimes there are some great things that happen with mothballing. A good example is Glendronach, when they went into mothballs and then they came back out. If you bought a bottle of 15-year-old whiskey, for a while there, it was probably closer to an 18-year-old whiskey. So there's some great things for us as consumers that happen when a distillery is mothballed. But there's also other logistics you have to think about, like you're changing from one master distiller to another, and what is going on with the style of that whiskey as it moves forward. So we're going to talk about all that sort of stuff. We're going to also get into a little discussion about sherry barrels, which I think you will find very interesting. And we're going to do tasting of two of their whiskeys, Bladnoch 10 and Samsara. And we'll go through and do some tasting notes on those and talk a little bit about how they're making those whiskeys. So lots of great stuff going on in this conversation. I'm looking forward to sharing this with you and giving a little bit of the history of Bladnoch as well. And we're going to pick up this conversation talking a little bit about how Bladnoch had actually served some of its recent life as a tourist attraction rather than a distillery.
But you're right that especially in the last kind of 20 years, 20, 30 years of Bladnoch, the distillery was open a lot more for a sort of a tourist attraction and, like you say, an event space that meant that a lot of people have quite fond memories of Bladnoch. Either they've been to an event there, or it was really quite an open door. And actually, last year when we opened our visitor centre, we've got a lot of course, international visitors, but also a lot of locals who've headed to Bladnoch and they want to look around and see the renovations that we've done. And David might have bought Bladnoch out of administration. He might have rebuilt it, but it's a 203-year-old distillery. So the story of Bladnoch goes much further back than our company kind of owning it, and that's been great to sort of connect with all the people who have this long kind of history with the distillery.
So let's talk about David right up front. This is kind of the end of the story, getting to the tail end. We'll go back into the history here in a bit, but is he the first Australian to own a Scotch whiskey distillery?
Look, as far as we know, he is the first Aussie. It's one of those things that Scotch distilleries, even in the well into the past, have been kind of these sort of globally coveted things to own. Is that there's been people from all around the world that have bought great Scotch distilleries. And, the 130 or so distilleries are pretty tightly held. There's not a lot of independent kind of transfer of ownership of Scotch distilleries. And, when the opportunity came up for David, it was pretty exciting, the opportunity to have an old, beautiful Scotch distillery, to kind of rebuild and to reinvigorate. There's a lot of new distilleries being built, even some of them are kind of resurrecting old names. Rosebank is on the way back. You've got Laura Zabby, you've got new brands like McNean and Newmuchen, and there's a lot of kind of greenfield type projects where they're sort of creating a brand new distillery. But to buy an old distillery and kind of continue this legacy, but doing it from an office in Melbourne is it's pretty different.
So Lowland Whiskey is an interesting concept because Lowland Whiskeys, I think, going back in history, you think of Lowland whiskey being used more for blended scotches back in the days when they were trying to compete with the Irish distilleries, and the single malts were probably more coming from the Speyside and Highlands regions. So describe Lowland Scotch, because I know there'll be a lot of people going, well, I've heard the term, but I don't know a lot of distilleries. What would you say is a characteristic of Lowland Scotch?
So the answer I'm going to tell you is probably not the one that you want, which is that, I think that geography and kind of regionality is becoming less and less important in the Scotch world. You're absolutely right that, traditionally there was a lot of triple distilled whiskey out of the Lowlands. There was a lot of, there's still today is a lot of grain whiskey produced in our region. Some of the major grain whiskey distilleries are in the Lowlands, whether they're Cameron Bridge making grain whiskey for Diageo, or Strathclyde, or North British, making grain whiskey for big distilling groups. That being said, I think that the Lowlands category has really been only a handful of players in the last sort of 30 or 40 years, and certainly over in the US, if I go to a liquor store in the US and it's separated by region, I've got 2 or 3 full walls of Speyside Scotch and maybe 1 or 2 of Islay and Lowlands. If we're lucky, we might get a shelf right down the bottom. There might be like a couple of bottles in the corner. Yeah. And Campbelltown's got its own designation as a Scotch region, which has only got 3 distilleries. The Lowlands wasn't too far behind, to be honest, despite being geographically a very, very large, surface area of the country. We've got only a couple of distilleries down there, but that really is changing. There's a lot of new distilleries in our area. As I mentioned, Rosebank, classic Lowlands distillery is coming back and it's been rebuilt. Got new distilleries like Glasgow Distillery Company, which is making some fantastic whiskies. Annandale, another old brand that's kind of being reborn, which is only a few miles away from us. So there is some kind of styles coming back, but what it's doing, of course, is it's I guess showcasing the diversity that the whiskey that can be distilled and produced in that region. So every so often I'll talk to someone going, oh, so you're not triple distilled like most Lowlands. I'm like, well, let's be honest, the only Lowlands you're really seeing any great quantities of Auchentoshan, which is indeed triple distilled, Glenkinchie, which is double distilled, and Bladnoch is double distilled. So the triple distillation thing's kind of something from the past. I believe that Rosebank is going to triple distill, but Annandale's double distillation. The Glasgow Distillery Company is double distillation. There are a few new players in Edinburgh that are all double distillation. So that kind of like Lowlands, they used to call them very light and very kind of soft and kind of elegant and very kind of introductory type whiskies. I think that certainly Bladnoch, but many of the other Lowland distilleries are kind of moving away from that kind of stereotype, I suppose, of those Lowlands whiskey being very, very light and kind of easygoing. Great for blends. It's not to say that it doesn't make a good malt to put into a blend, but it's not the kind of primary reason for these Lowland distilleries existing anymore, because a lot of them have got some great brands, and like us, we're doing some things with some casks that give them a real bit of heft over and above that kind of light, sort of soft reputation that they've got.
What's interesting is that what we're drinking today was produced by the forerunners of the current ownership. So and this is an interesting thing to me about Bladnoch's history. And one of the things that I actually want to do a Whiskey Lore podcast around is the concept of mothballing a distillery and the special challenges that creates, because it's happened through the Scotch whiskey industry over and over again. Some very large distilleries went through some really rough times, and it's just like watching the stock market. It's going to be up markets, down markets, and you have to sort of predict these things out 10, 15 years in advance to know what's coming and what's not. So as we kind of roll back through your history and then come forward, it started in 1817 under the Macallan family, correct? And they owned it for all the way up until 1905.
Early 20th century, yeah.
Yeah. So what's interesting is they did an episode around the Pattison crash that occurred in the 1890s, when there was just this flooding of the market and speculation in Scotch whiskey, and they basically over distilled, and then the whole thing, the bottom just dropped out in 1900. And so many distilleries disappeared at that time, but this distillery actually lasted another 5 years beyond that. And then it kind of evolved from there between different ownerships. What were some of the special things that they were having to deal with back then in jumping from one owner to the next? Because your next owner was actually an Irish company that came in.
I think that you're absolutely right. There've been these kind of like booms and busts in the whiskey industry that have kind of taken place over the last sort of 200-300 years, sort of since whiskey distilling was a thing, and kind of earlier than that sort of turn of the century change. Of course, you had the introduction of licenses and of kind of distillation and taxes on distillation that pushed a lot of the Lowlands distilleries out in the kind of 1820s, where they moved north out of the reach and vision of the tax man. Of course, the Lowlands are close to England and closer to London. So, they were, for a tax man looking to collect his excise, he was much closer to the Lowlands to sort of shake him down and to get his quotas. So there are a lot that closed down in that kind of time. And brands like Annandale, for example, are ones that really shut down in that time. And then, of course, as you mentioned, you had lots of kind of challenges throughout the 19th century and then into the 20th century where, there was the kind of the glut in the market. And, I think also one of the things to remember is that, blended whiskey was pretty much all there was on the market until, much, much later than people think. I think that there's perhaps a misconception that, people in the late 19th century were sitting back drinking a nice glass of single malt, where it really wasn't the style. And so, whiskeys that had good consistent production and were, had good contracts really to produce blended whiskey were the ones that kind of weather any storm, because, there wasn't this sort of, hype around single malt distilleries that there is today of people, getting special releases and things like that. I think that it's one of the things that I think surprises people new to Scotch, is that actually single malt was not something that was really the primary focus for new distilleries right from the start. And one of the things that helped really Bladnoch survive is the fact that they were used in a lot of great blends, and that their particular distillery character was sought after by blenders all the way through into the sort of late 20th century. So you're absolutely right. Irish ownership in the kind of early 1900s, lots of periods of kind of the buildings being sold, assets being stripped out. The stills were all kind of completely scrapped and sold a few times. At one stage, they went to the set of stills went to Sweden for use distillation. So, I think that the kind of latter half of the 20th century also, of course, brought some new kind of focus on Bladnoch when Bell and Sons took it over, and they were making Bell's whiskey, blended whiskey with a little Bladnoch in it. In the 1980s and then kind of early 1990s, they opened a visitor centre at Bladnoch and had people visiting. It was all kind of looking pretty good for Bladnoch. And then in the early 1990s, there was the big sell-off of a lot of distilleries, or closure of distilleries by, at the time, United Distillers, part of kind of Guinness PLC, which of course were one of the component companies that became Diageo eventually. And there really was a real contraction in the industry, and a lot of those smaller distilleries that maybe didn't make so much commercial sense, were shuttered because they thought, well, let's focus on the big production sites, and that's where that's where the sort of future lies. And of course, the benefit of hindsight, 30 years later, a bottle of Rosebank will set you back $1,000 if you're lucky. Partly because it's good whiskey, but also partly because, of course, it's closed down, and it was thought, no one's ever going to want Rosebank. And fortunately for the whiskey world, there's Ian McLeod, rebuilding it. In the case of Bladnoch, however, it was sold to be turned into a holiday park. So
I guess this was around the time Diageo owned it at that point.
Well, as I say, so it was United Distillers, which would have become Diageo in the future,
okay,
but they sold it before they became Diageo. So Diageo was United Distillers, Guinness PLC, and Grand Metropolitan that made this sort of mega, wine and spirits company or beer and spirits company. And when they sold it, as I say, they sold out Rosebank and a number of other distilleries at the time. And They stopped distilling in 1993 and sold it to these two Northern Irish brothers, the Armstrongs, who, as I say, wanted to turn it into like a bit of a tourist attraction, a holiday park. You can go and stay. And we were mentioning before, as an event centre, and they were running weddings and various other celebrations at the distillery. And, they started off with this great idea that like, it'll be, an old distillery and there's lots of barrels and it's a great tourist destination, and realised pretty quickly that actually where this opportunity lay was to create whiskey. Mm. And so, they started distilling whiskey again in 2000, and it took a lot of backwards and forwards when it was at the time it was Diageo to kind of get the rights to still distill whiskey as Bladnoch. And there was a lot of backward and forward, and they had a very, very strict literage limit on how much whiskey they could produce, because Diageo, in their mind, it had been closed down, and that was the end of Bladnoch. And they were still selling Bladnoch in 2000. They still had the 10-year-old flora and fauna is still a very well loved expression of Bladnoch that's released as a distillery, as an original bottling out of Bladnoch. So there was this sort of uneasy alliance to say, well, yeah, you guys can make a bit of Bladnoch, but you've got to keep it pretty, kind of low key and small volume, because we don't want you to really kind of, affecting us. And there was some pretty robust discussions. But from 2000 to 2009, they were distilling, Bladnoch in small quantities, at the distillery, and you could visit and you could, have your wedding there at an active distillery. So
yeah. That's got to be tough, though, to be really limited at how much. I mean, because the question comes up, why did they end up in 2009 no longer producing whiskey? And I guess they couldn't sell it off, or they held on to it till around 2014 or so. Is that and so you're thinking this stuff is just coming to maturity, that they were distilling in 2000 and now they have to give it up. How does that happen?
Yeah, look, without going into the gory details, basically it was I'll share with you over a dram in person one day, Drew.
Okay, all right.
Basically, it was a family dispute.
Okay.
There were two brothers, and they just did not see eye to eye about the future of Bladnoch. And one of the brothers wanted to keep distilling and keep making whiskey. The other brother definitely didn't. And when you've got 50-50 ownership, you need some consensus to do things like buy barley and yeast and casks and maintain the equipment and things like that. So it kind of came to a head, in 2009. And essentially the kind of dispute played out over the kind of coming years, and got to the point, in 2014 where they're like, look, we just need to sell this and kind of go our separate ways. And so, it wasn't any kind of financial distress. It really was that there were two owners who just could not agree on what the future of Bladnoch looked like. So, what we had, of course, with Bladnoch was a distillery that hadn't been producing for 6 years at least, and certainly for sort of 30 years of any great volume. The early 90s was the last time that Bladnoch was selling casks to independent bottlers, for example. Mm-hmm. So today, if you see a single malt Scotch Whisky Society or a Gordon MacPhail bottling of Bladnoch, it's from 1991, 92, 93.
Wow.
Because that's the last time they were selling it, because that's the last time they had the volume. When they produced a small amount, they were keeping it for themselves. So, Bladnoch didn't have a huge presence internationally. They were only exporting to a handful of countries. Like you said, they'd only been kind of just coming to maturity, the stuff that they distilled. So, they had a 11-year-old was kind of the oldest that they're really pushing. They had a few older ones from some old barrels that they bought, when they bought the distillery, but it's pretty limited. And so, when David bought it in 2015, he had a 203-year-old brand. He had 50 acres of, beautiful corner of Scotland. But and we had some casks, but we really had almost a kind of start from scratch again. Wow. And those beautiful bottles you've got sitting there, that was a big part of it. Is the previous presentation of Bladnoch was very, very small run, all hand bottled, hand labelled. The old bottles, that the age statement was a sticker, so it was the same label. They would just put a little 11-year-old sticker on an 18-year-old, 19-year-old. And it's like, they were following the rules, of course. But it was definitely a 18-year-old, but you'd have the sticker, and then you'd see the little square on it where they were like, and that's an 18-year-old, and it was a very, very, very small operation.
I was going to say, it's not what you expect out of a 203-year-old distillery. You think that would probably be happening at a brand new startup craft distillery.
No, in fact, quite the opposite. You absolutely expect it to be in a 200-year-old distillery. You don't expect that to be in a new distillery where they're like, at least they'll buy a new printer, or they'll work with some, sort of design company. But these guys, they were really, really, really in-house, and a couple of the team actually worked for the old owners, and we always laugh at stories about them like sitting there on a Friday night, like peeling the stickers off and sticking them on the bottles. But it's a very it's a good story, and the great thing is, of course, is that it gave the message to people who were real whiskey lovers: hunt out a Bladnoch and find it, because it's, once you get your hands on it, it's a rare thing. And that's kind of continued now into the ownership of Bladnoch. But what we wanted to do is to really just lift the presentation and to, recognize the fact that there aren't a lot of barrels of Bladnoch out there.
Mm-hmm.
You've got two products there. You've got the 10-year-old, the Samsara. Samsara is a consistent product for us, but 10-year-old, there's no more 10-year-old being produced. We have already emptied those barrels,
wow.
those 10-year-old barrels,
yeah,
and it is done. And our 17-year-old now is out of stock in the US because it's sold. In fact, globally, US was the last market, and we sold our last case of it in October, and there's no more left. The 15-year-old, we sold our last case. We've still got a few cases around the US. You should find it in a retailer. But when we bought these barrels, you can't empty them twice. The barrels that we've got are, when we bought the place, those are the ones that have to last us. So our aged Bladnoch expressions are rare and pretty special. And unfortunately, the quality is very, very good. Despite the fact they were putting the stickers on the bottles, the whiskey they were making, the casks they were using were really great. So.
I'm going to be slow on drinking these then. I have a rare bottle here. So that's really the challenge when you have a distillery that's been mothballed. There's two things that I would think would be issues. One would be you're changing distillers. So does the philosophy, does the character of the whiskey change from company and master distiller to another master distiller when there's such a wide gap between the years?
I think that when we rebuilt the distillery, we refurbished the mill that crushes the barley, built new washbacks, and we went from a single pair of stills to two pair of stills, completely rebuilt. So I think that probably makes more difference than changing the master distiller, because the shape of the stills is pretty immutable. That being said, one of the things about the old owners of Bladnoch is that they used to sell and commercially a new make spirit. Okay, so you could buy it straight off the still. Some people call it cleric, but basically it's fresh off the still, cut down to sort of cask strength for putting in a cask. And so we had some good examples to sort of understand what the traditional, the old Bladnoch used to taste like. And it doesn't mean that we didn't make some adjustments, but it meant that we could kind of, at least compare and contrast the whiskey that was being made, in the last 30 years to what we're making now. In terms of the master distiller, we've had two master distillers. Ian McMillan joined us from Distell, where he was master distiller of, Bunnahabhain and Topamori, Leduc, and Deanston. And he really was responsible for the kind of the build and the kind of creating all this new equipment.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's now a consultant, and he's working on, a lot of, again, new distilleries. And he's just announced that he's part of the team building the new Wolf Craig distillery in Stirling. And he handed over last year to Nick Savage, who obviously from the Macallan had also just been through a pretty big renovation. What I think that Nick's doing really well, and Nick's got it was funny when I heard that Nick was joining, I was talking to a few industry people, and like, this guy he knows his wood, and that's his real passion. Nick's an engineer, he's got a PhD, he's a bright guy, but I remember when he joined, and he was with us in our office in Australia, and he got the blackboard out, and he got real deep into like the molecular structure of lignin and and like the sort of tertiary effects of aging, and the guy sort of he's drawing some organic chemistry symbols of like and here's the strength of these bonds, and our marketing team's going, I'm not quite sure how we can put this onto a poster, but
you're going right brain to left brain all of a sudden.
Yeah, our marketing team's going, this is not very sexy. Put this long chain hydrocarbon on a poster, but the guy's got this really deep understanding of the long-term effects of wood, and I guess that's what he's really brought is. He's thinking really, really, into the future of Bladnoch. We're sitting here going, I can count the number of casks still remaining from the early 90s, pretty much in two hands. We've almost got names, you know what I mean? Like these casks are like family members, and unfortunately, you've got to slaughter a family member to bottle a 30-year-old whiskey. You can't replace them. And we want to be in a situation where, Bladnoch has the strength and it has the stocks to be able to really build a big, strong future, because it's been through this, like you said, there's been a real up and down period over the last 200 years that, it hasn't always been so clear that it was going to survive. So, where Nick's really brought all this expertise is less in the distilling and more in the what do we need to put down? What's in the future for Bladnoch? And let's make sure that, we're not in a situation where basically, Bladnoch has to be kind of restricted so that people can't buy it. I mean, one of our biggest complaints is that, we get on our social media, oh, look, I live in, Minnesota, or I live in, I'm trying to think of some more control states, Utah.
Well, South Carolina, where I'm at, is probably a challenge.
And I can't get hold of it because, when in the US we're kind of looking at, a few thousand bottles for the whole country, because that's all we made, then we want to bring more people to Bladnoch, and the only way we're going to do that is by really kind of hunkering down and laying down whiskey for the future, so that we can keep growing.
All right, so I'm going to stop torturing myself right now because I've been smelling this whiskey the entire time, and I know there's probably people who are going, "How do you hold on to whiskey that long without go this far in?" Shows you how much of a history geek I am. So this is my first chance to really kind of nose and taste this one. So this is Samsara. So go ahead and, if you could, kind of describe what this is, because this is a non-age stated whiskey, correct?
Sure. So we've been talking for a while about the history of Bladnoch and how we stopped distilling in 2009. So it doesn't take a math genius to work out that even though it's got a non-age statement, we haven't got any whiskey that's any younger than 2009. And in fact, here's a bit of a kind of a behind the scenes look exclusively on whiskey lore, is that in 2009, the only whiskey we produced was a very short run of peated whiskey. Oh. I say we, of course, was the previous owners.
Yeah.
So there's none of that goes into Samsara. So the youngest it could possibly be is 2008, and of course some of it is older than that. But the future of Samsara, we will be bringing some younger whiskies in. The non-age statement is an interesting one because, of course, there's this real obsession with the number of years on the bottle, and again, it's a little bit like that. The cheese story I'm telling about. Yeah. Aged whiskey doesn't mean that it's exceptional, but it's helpful for people to know, okay, how old is this whiskey that I'm drinking, to kind of give them a bit of a steer. In the case of Samsara, though, the important thing about it is that it is Californian red wine cask is the flavor that Samsara is all about. Nick calls them character-led whiskies, and maybe that sounds like a bit of marketing guff, but the point is that what makes Samsara so interesting is that Californian red wine. Red wine is becoming more popular, I would say, as a cask finish, or as a kind of a maturation, story of using red wine. California red wine is pretty unusual, and it's unusual for a couple of reasons. One is that it's very far from Scotland. You think that, well, you live in South Carolina because you're a little bit closer, but
a little bit,
from Californian coast to Scotland is a pain. And I'm buying some casks at the moment, and I'm like, surely there's a cheaper way to do it. So Drew, if you want to make the drive over to Napa with your hatchback, and you want to put half a dozen casks in, I'll reward you in whiskey, because it's
nice.
A real pain in the butt to get casks that far. And the second thing, of course, is that the style of it, especially if it's an American oak, although Californians are using European and American oak. It's quite a sweet style. The winemaking techniques are still are much more diverse in California than they are in if you take a Bordeaux cask or like a Rioja even I've seen some Sauterne casks being used as well for aging. So there's definitely a sort of a disincentive to search further afield than Europe when you're looking for wine casks, but we're really happy with the Californian story. And we've got some great partnerships with great winery. And in fact, I've got a good friendship with a team at a winery in California called Samsara Wines as well. It just happened to be the name of their winery is the same as the name of our Bladnoch whiskey. And, they're, I send them some Samsara whiskey, which they love and they enjoy, and it's quite a good little coincidence. And so I think that for me, the connection to Californian wine is definitely quite a difference. And for me, the flavor in the whiskey is something that, for me anyway, you line up all the Bladnochs and I will be able to tell you which one's Samsara, and you'll be line me a Samsara with a whole lot of other whiskies. That's the one I'll pick. Something really sherried like our Adela 15-year-old. I might be able to pick it. I mean, I could pretend that I could always pick it blindfolded in a thunderstorm, but it's a bit easier. Whereas Samsara's got such a special and unique nose to it that look, it's not for everyone. That's the great thing about whiskey. There's a lot of single malts out there, but that nose is quite unusual. It's quite creamy. It's almost got that, like, again, maybe I'm imagining it, but like that malolactic kind of nose to it, where you've got that kind of soft creaminess to it, which my brain connects it to the fact that it's in a wine cask, but really it's a lot of it's about the whiskey. It's got a very I won't say a sweetness, but it's like the sort of I get the impression of sweetness out of this whiskey rather than some which are, for example, I don't know if you tried the new Glenmorangie Tale of Cake, which is in Tokai casks. There's a real really forward sweetness to that whiskey, whereas Samsara is a little more subtle.
Yeah.
But it's Californian wine. It's Syrah and Merlot. It's not big Cabernet. It's not heavily tannic and like really structured in terms of the flavor. It's still pretty soft. So it's a nice whiskey. I think also worth mentioning, of course, is that we don't chill filter any of our single malts. Mm-hmm. We don't add any color, so you can see really clearly in the shot we've got here just how different the color is between our 10-year-old and our Samsara. There is no E150. There's no caramel coloring. It is how it comes out of the barrel. So 46.7%, no color added, non-chill filtered. It's a really, we don't need to mess around with it. We only make a small amount of Bladnoch, so it's pretty good as it comes.
Is this one of those that's then destined to disappear for a little while and then come back?
Well, the fortunate thing about Samsara is that because it's character led, what we need is the California red wine, not necessarily the aged barrels. Now we've got no choice, right? We have to use old barrels because that's all we've got. But in the future, as we start to bring some more younger whiskies online, we'll combine the older whiskies with some of the younger ones so that we can keep producing Samsara, and that's the thing for us. So.
Makes a very interesting and unique flavor, as you say. It doesn't remind me of any other whiskey that I've had. I get some of the apple in there, and but it does kind of have a little bit of a wine character to it. It's almost like I don't want to say it's vinegary, but because there's a sweetness there, but it's almost like when you have wine, I can sometimes connect closer to a vinegar kind of a thing in some particular wines. So it's also interesting because there's been such a trend for such a long time to go to sherry barrels, and I know sherry barrels are extremely expensive. And now you have a situation where they're producing this sherry and they're just dumping most of it because nobody's buying it, but the casks are worth more. And then you bring in a master distiller who worked for a distillery that works heavily with sherry barrels. So it's interesting to see is he kind of reinventing himself, moving from Macallan down to a much smaller distillery, obviously, maybe with some more flexibility in it. Is that kind of what the idea was, but behind his move, and why he's kind of maybe pushing to these new directions?
Well, it sounds like you need a follow-up interview with Nick, and maybe I'll talk to him tonight and let him know. He'll watch to make sure you haven't hatch a job on me on this interview and edit it to something that I didn't mean, but look, we'd love to connect you. So I won't speak too much to why he moved to Bladnoch, other than to say that he's really public about the the fact that he moved because he had that freedom, like you said, he was a lot more given a lot more. He's given a lot more creative control at Bladnoch to kind of tell that story. And that for anyone who's a sort of an artisan, let's be honest, whiskey making is as much an art as a science.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of attractiveness in being given kind of keys to the distillery and say kind of go nuts. So sherry casks is a really interesting one. You bring up a good point, and it's one that I think is probably not well understood by people kind of outside the industry, is that there's kind of a misconception that there are bodegas in Jerez that are making sherry, and the byproduct of it is casks. And they're making sherry and they're selling it to elderly English, aristocrats to drink sherry with in the day, or hilariously, very cool hipster bartenders in Portland. The most excited I've ever seen someone about sherry is I went to Seattle recently, or last year, of course, pre-COVID, and I went to Seattle, and our distributor there in Seattle is fantastic. The guys at American Northwest are an amazing distributor up there, and they kick ass for Bladnoch and a lot of great whiskies. And the person who took me around was like, she was in her 20s and she was very cool, and she had the big network of bartenders, and her big passion was sherry. I'm like, are you serious? I'm not talking sherry cask. I'm talking like Fino and PX, and she knew about, she knew way more than I did about sherry, and I spent a lot of money in Spain on casks, and she was like, oh yeah, sherry. I'm like, yeah, that's very Washington, there's a lot of love for really weird and wacky categories, and the bartenders are mad for sherry, and they've got they all went to bars with 100 different sherries, and I was like, yeah, that's a really kind of funny sort of connection, because for me, I went to school in the UK, and I always remember, we had and again, this is very British, but we had a end of the school semester and lunch with the headmaster, and we all got a glass of sherry at the end of it. This is and he was a very old school headmaster, and he was like, yeah, we'll have a sherry and talk about the school term past. And for me, that's what sits in my mind, is that's the time to drink sherry with a whole lot of very kind of everyone in a suit and tie and sitting in a 300-year-old study, or in a cool bar in Seattle, with sherry. So to get back to the whiskey world, though, the barrels that we in all the whiskey world get are not barrels that are left over from sherry production. They are barrels that are made for the whiskey world.
Mm.
So they are seasoned specifically to be sold. And the bodega obviously is making sherry for drinking, but they're primarily making sherry, a lot of them, so that they have a seasoning agent almost to put into the barrels to season them, because like you say, they are very expensive. And so the sherry they don't really care about, although again, if a few of them went on holiday to Seattle, they might be a bit more excited about the future of sherry. But these guys are making sherry casks basically, and they are seasoning them, and we have to order them years in advance, because they need to really give a good amount of seasoning. But it's not like it's not this kind of symbiotic. And I think there's sometimes a bit of marketing fluff about, the sherry world and the whiskey world working in tandem, where you've got all these bodegas making sherry, and all the leftover barrels get used. Because you got to remember that most sherry is made in a Solera system, where the barrels sit in a Solera for could be up to 60 or 70 years.
Mm.
So there's not an ongoing supply of ex-Solera sherry barrels that are ready for used to make whiskey. We do get them occasionally, and they are great. But they're good stories and so forth. But primarily, you're taking a new European oak barrel, filling it with sherry for a couple of years, dropping the sherry, and then it goes off to the Scotch whisky industry. And the sherry that's left over is so heavily oaked, because of course it hasn't been in a Solera, it's a fresh barrel, that it's usually distilled down to make food alcohol or vinegar, or they use it for other things. It's not like the casks are a byproduct. The sherry is a byproduct of cask production.
That's fascinating. Well, thank you for being the person who actually solidified that notion of mine, because I had heard hints about that, but sometimes you get hearsay and you you hate to repeat it because you're not quite sure. But yeah, thanks for the confirmation on that. So let's talk about the 10-year. This, ooh, man, that smells nice.
So 10-year was a product that we launched in 2018. It wasn't, Samsara was one of our first whiskies we launched back in it's a short amount of time for Bladnoch, but in 2017 we released Samsara. We released a 15-year-old sherry cask and a 25-year-old port pipe, which is now completely sold out. There's only one place you can get port pipe now in the US. In fact, that's the only place in the world, which is Texas. We're in Specs Liquor down in Texas, and they're pretty much our last holdout with the very last few cases of port pipe Bladnoch is down in Specs. But we released the 10-year-old when it turned 10, as I say, in 2018, and it was a really good opportunity for a lot more people to discover Bladnoch because, hey, at the end of the day, we've got to talk about price. At the end of the day, people still got to shell out their hard-earned money for a bottle of whiskey. So 10-year-old was our chance, as I say, to get more people into Bladnoch because it was priced at we're certainly not the cheapest whiskey on the shelf, but the SRP of 10-year-old is $65, and it ranges depending on how friendly your state is towards taxation between $50 and $70. And it really was the chance for us to grow the Bladnoch awareness globally and not just in the US. So one of the other great things about this specific 10-year-old that we've bottled here is that it's 100% bourbon cask. What that means is that not only is it, that's a great kind of classic, whiskey cask story, but it's also what Bladnoch was probably best known for the real aficionados who knew that that underlying kind of flavor of the whiskey of Bladnoch of old, I suppose. And, you mentioned quite rightly that this is whiskey that we didn't distill. We bought the barrels and we're bottling it. But unlike some of our wine finishes where we've re-racked the whiskey and given it some different finishes, this one really is like basically barrels that have been selected and vatted and put into the bottle. And it's been a great bridge, I guess, between the old Bladnoch and the new Bladnoch. And, next year, currently it's everywhere but the US because unfortunately Americans insist on 750 ml bottles, unlike Europe, which insists on 700 ml bottles.
We want a little extra.
Yeah, you want a little bit of a top up.
Yeah.
And so those 50 mils mean that unfortunately we can't ship our new products to the US. We have to make them specifically for the market. But next year the US will join the rest of the world and get the 11-year-old, which is actually still bourbon cask, and it's just obviously a bit older. And it's the kind of the vatting that's been selected by Nick Savage to kind of be the new kind of first age statement Bladnoch that's out there. So this one here, as I say, it's I wouldn't say it's the purest, but it's the classic Bladnoch, and it's one that's got us a lot of love around the sort of the world of whiskey reviewers. They really, really enjoy that Bladnoch 10, and I think they'll enjoy 11 because it's from the same stock. And I think that there's a lot of people who've discovered Bladnoch through the 10-year-old, and then they move their way up to the other whiskies where maybe if they hadn't heard of Bladnoch, they weren't going to jump on a bottle of Adela for kind of $100, $120. Yeah. But once they try the 10, they're like, okay, I understand what these guys are making, and then they go on that journey, and so now they can discover some of our other expressions.
So it's interesting because my dive into Scotch, I started watching Ralphie.com. And it's very rare that you see him get giddy about a whiskey and talking about a whiskey. But his video review on 10 was he was quite happy with it.
He is. In fact, even a couple of weeks ago, he said, "Here's my 3 best whiskies of 2020," and he included Bladnoch 10. We were very, very honoured to be considered to be one of the best whiskies because there's a lot of great whiskies out there, and some distilleries putting some fantastic juice out there. But yeah, you're right. And look, we don't make whiskey just for reviewers, and we're obviously always very grateful to get good reviews. But we want people to buy it and to enjoy it and to add to their love and knowledge of Scotch whisky by putting Bladnoch on their shelf. Ralphie doesn't like everything that we make. He's not a big fan of our 15-year-old Adela. But that's one thing about Scotch is that it's a subjective thing. There's no hard and fast rule about.
Right.
What whiskey should be for a particular palate, and we're certainly proud of all the whiskey that we put out, and we know that everything that we put out finds an audience that does love it.
But you bring up a great point. And actually, when I started my whiskey journey, I spent a lot of time watching Ralphie for Scotch, and I started watching other reviewers. And what I learned after a period of time was that everybody's palate is different. Everybody's going to have certain things that they're drawn to. I like the flavor of licorice in a whiskey. That draws me. Or I can be drawn in by apple. I love the taste of apple in a whiskey. Or I love peat in a whiskey. But there's different types of peat, and some are ashy, and some of them are earthy, and some are herbal. So as you get past that initial point of just sipping a whiskey here or there and just saying it tastes like whiskey, once you start getting into that mode where you're actually paying a lot more attention, I do see, especially when I do video reviews, that it's more important to say, here's what I'm picking out of it, and not to necessarily say this is a score of this or a score of that, or this is a good whiskey or this is a bad whiskey, but instead to say, this is why I like this whiskey, or here's what you may find appealing in here, or you may taste it and you'll taste something completely different. Because one of the things I see in reviews is that you can go through 6 different review websites on the same whiskey and they will have completely different tasting notes.
I always laugh when people, when I'm doing a trade show, I do a lot of trade shows. Well, up until this year, I used to do a lot. Normally I do a lot of trade shows. And you're right, the diversity of tasting notes, of flavors and things like that, you almost think that, are you drinking the same whiskey? You know what I mean? Like, short of big obvious ones, like, currently none of our range is peated. So if someone says, I can really taste, smoke and the sea and salty brightness, I'm like, you must have a dirty glass. But other than that, there is a big variety. And I've had everyone say, Samsara is a good example, from winey kind of, like soft fruits and things like that, through to it tastes like clotted cream, or there's so many things, because again, flavor and aroma is very emotional, and it's very, like, depending on your experience. And I think a great example with when we're talking about flavor notes is Nick. So it's very easy to see, if you read the Nick's tasting notes and all the Bladnochs that he produces, that he is a sweet tooth. The guy loves candy.
Yeah.
And sometimes he'll give a note. I'm like, what the heck is that? And I'm going to Google it. And it's some British candy. I'm like, we can't put this on a bottle, because like a whiskey drinker in China is not going to understand what this like regional British candy is. So we have to ask, like, let's come up with something else. I mean, hey, look, it's tough enough saying this tastes like Christmas cake, because one of our biggest markets actually for Bladnoch, and certainly for Pure Scott, is Israel. Bladnoch 10 is kosher. The distillery is kosher certified, and both Pure Scots are kosher certified. Now, saying something tastes like Christmas cake does not connect with the consumer in Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
So we've got to really think carefully about how we do the flavors to make them not generic, but make them as understandable by people. But I've heard some crackers at trade shows. I've heard people put their nose in it and go, yeah, this smells like at 5 minutes past dawn on a northern Scottish field. I'm facing east. I've had 1 cup of tea, and it's about 40 degrees, and I'm like,
where are you going with that?
What are you talking about?
Yeah.
But what they're talking about, of course, is how they feel when they drink whiskey, and that's cool. I think that's great. And there's one of the greatest restaurant experiences I ever had was at El Cellar de Cana Roca, which is in Spain. It's not far from Barcelona. And I don't know if it still is, but it's usually one of the best restaurants in the world. And I went years ago. And their tasting experience, actually, you went into a little room and they're like, and it was a wine tasting at the time. I think they had a sherry as well. And what they did is they said, okay, you're going to drink this wine. It was a Pinot Grigio or whatever. You drank the wine. He's like, now. And he took off the like tablecloth, and underneath there was a big bowl of like silver marbles. He's like, put your hands in it. And we're like, this is crazy Spanish place. And he's like, this is what I feel when I'm drinking this wine. But, the feeling of these silver balls in a bowl. I mean, it was completely mad, and we thought it was really funny, and we were laughing away. But it was fun. But he got it in one, which is that drinking something and experiencing something emotionally, it can activate other senses than just flavor. And sometimes, doing other sensory experiences will kind of trigger some other kind of memory when you're drinking whiskey, when you're drinking a wine. And I think that, again, I think there's a midpoint between just tastes like whisk scotch and let's go swimming in a bowl of marbles. Like restaurant. There's somewhere in the middle, and I think that when people say stuff like, "Oh, it reminds me of standing in a Scottish field," what they're telling you is how they feel when they drink it. I think that's really cool, even if it's not necessarily the most relatable tasting note that we're going to put back on the bottle.
Well, I appreciate you walking me through the whiskeys and the history and getting a whole. I don't get to talk to Scotch whiskey people as much now since I'm been hunkered down here in the U.S. I've been doing my tours of Kentucky and Tennessee while I've been, in this sort of travel limbo. So I'm looking forward to finally being able to get overseas again whenever that opens up. And
well, you might be visiting Bladnoch before I do. It's really, who knows what the next year is going to bring. So,
yeah.
I mean, one thing I will say that we are really looking forward to, and I won't ever bring politics into it, but boy, do we want these tariffs to go from the US.
Absolutely,
they're good for nobody. And I mean, I don't know. It's meant to be about aviation companies that's all started, but it's not good for us as a producer. It's not good for you as a consumer. It's not that good for the retailers. When I'm thinking about releasing a new product, when Nick and I are talking about what's some cool new Bladnochs to release, every discussion has to have the tariffs in there because it pushes the price up, and we're kind of like, if I'm selling it to Germany, they don't have tariffs, so who's going to be first in line? So, I mean, I don't know if things are going to change, post January 20th. But I mean, our hope in the industry is like it's universal. You'll not find someone who works in Scotch, and in fact, throughout the whole kind of journey of a whiskey getting to the hands of someone in the US, like nobody wants the tariffs. People are already starting to see the price creep up on the shelf.
Yeah.
We've done our very best to keep our prices down as much as we can, but we're a small distillery. We haven't got the deep pockets that the big guys do to kind of eat that cost. And 25% is it's really substantial. So our kind of big hope for 2021 is we want to bring all these new products to the US and we want to keep growing the market, but we've got to do everything we can to get rid of these tariffs. They're just no good for anyone. And of course, in Europe, there's a 25% tariff on bourbon and all American whiskeys, and it looks like they're bringing in one on vodka and rum and gin from the US as well. So we've got nothing to do with this dispute, and we're the ones really suffering from it, which seems very unfair, but that's what trade disputes are about. It's like kicking you where it hurts. And, definitely hurt for us. So
yeah,
if any of your followers or viewers are have a line to the US trade negotiation team, we want your help to get tariffs taken out.
Believe me, I preach it. Because I love Scotch, so for me it's hard watching this, and it's also hard to go overseas. And when I'm in Ireland or Scotland and looking on the shelf and I see Jim Beam and Jack Daniels, and those are the only two American whiskeys on the shelf, and then I talk to people over there and they go, well, we don't really like bourbon. Kind of the same way that people over here will go, we don't really like Scotch, like it's a universal thing and every single Scotch tastes the same. It's the same sort of opinion that sometimes I feel I get over there. And it's like, there's a whole explosion of craft distillers over here. There's such a great variety of whiskeys going on all over the world. And these tariffs are doing nothing but, holding people back from being able to experience a world worth of whiskeys.
Yeah, I mean, I it's been a long time since I've looked at purchasing a Boeing aircraft, so I'm just quite unsure why.
Yeah, it's just bizarre.
Tariffs from, so.
It's bizarre. Well, again, I appreciate you taking time today and walking us through these. And how many states are you in right now, would you say?
We're about 20 states in the US. So we're in California, Washington State, Oregon, Texas, Florida, Illinois, New York. We have just got into Georgia, so not far from.
Oh, you're not far from me. Yeah, I can go there.
Yeah. Just going to George Craig, new distributor there. Just going to Tennessee as well. So the only control state that we're in is Montana. Somebody from Montana got in touch with our importer and said, we're getting a lot of inquiries about Bladnoch. So you can get Bladnoch in Montana in the state liquor store, which is pretty cool. So
nice.
We're growing, kind of adding a couple of states every month or two. So our hope is that by the end of next year we can be across all at least the lower 48 states. So.
Very nice. And so it'll be probably not the 10-year that we're going to be finding anywhere.
Probably not the 10. Yeah, so it'll be the 11-year-old.
Okay.
We've got a couple of new expressions coming out next year. Obviously, Pure Scott, the Samsara. So you'll see a range of releases coming out. We do have on our website. I'm going to do a little plug here. You can go on our website and you can actually order direct. And we work with a partner called Mash and Grape, who kind of is the intermediary to manage the 3-tier system. So you can actually buy all our products on our website.
Oh, nice.
And it'll tell you if we've got to send it to your state, and basically it'll kind of manage all of the logistics to get a bottle, sent straight to you. But, how a lot of people are buying these days is that, with all the restrictions on retailers, there's a big push towards people buying online. Unfortunately, again, I don't want to just complain about the US today because you guys are
We forgive you. We forgive you.
Your 3-tier system is a massive headache for us to get around. So we've got a good partner with that, and you can buy all our whiskeys online, and it'll be delivered from your local liquor store.
Well, thank you very much. Again, I appreciate your time today, and now people are hopefully a lot more aware of Bladnoch, and they'll start looking at Lowland Scotch as another region that is definitely worth checking out.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for having me, Drew, and I'm looking forward to, again, having you at the distillery and seeing kind of the behind the curtain, and we do tours from our distillery, which we're pretty transparent. You get a real look at how things are made, and you'll see that there are no computers and there's no sort of automation. It's still very much handmade, and we're really proud of that. So one day when travel is free again, then we'd love to have you over, or anyone else that wants to come and have a look at Bladnoch and how it's made, and obviously we've got some great whiskey.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Will Pitchforth from Bladnoch. You can find out more information about them at bladnoch.com. And find show notes and our Whiskey Lore competed drinking glasses, hoodies, books, and more at whiskey-lore.com. Make sure that you're subscribed or that you follow Whiskey Lore on your favorite podcast app or on Spotify. And Whiskey Lore is a production of Travel Fuels Life, LLC. Until next time, cheers and Slanjava.